Hi, we are Priyanka and Rishika, and we are back with a follow up of our earlier video on how crucial laws were amended without regard to established parliamentary processes in the monsoon session of the Indian Parliament. This session was held in July and August last year.
You can check out our previous video, it's linked in the description below, to understand how amendments brought to crucial environmental and health related laws in the monsoon session were problematic, both in terms of what the amendments entailed and the undemocratic manner in which they were rushed through. They relate to the Forest Conservation Act, the Biological Diversity Act, and the Jan Vishwas Act.
Today, we want to go a little deeper. Our research in the past few months and the proceedings of the parliamentary special session in September and the winter session in December gave us further insights into how our parliament works. What we found is that the Indian parliamentary processes are not codified well enough to uphold democratic principles. This means that our lawmakers didn't always translate parliamentary processes into hard and fast rules with a legal basis. Instead, several important processes remained optional, either in the form of guidelines from the law ministry or in the form of traditions which are followed merely by custom.
The assumption behind not codifying all parliamentary processes seems to have been trust that the MPs would use the principles of democracy while interpreting guidelines and traditions. And MPs have honored this trust often enough. For instance, requiring public consultation before introducing important bills into the parliament has never been a rule. And yet, historically, ministries have conducted these consultations because it is part of democratic functioning.
So, what do these parliamentary rules, guidelines, and traditions do? They tell MPs how to carry out important functions of the parliament, such as lawmaking and such as seeking information and accountability during question hour. This brings us to the core point of our current episode. The ruling BJP government has been breaking rules and interpreting long standing guidelines and traditions to further its own interests. This has led to several laws being rushed through both houses of parliament without scrutiny.
Now, to understand the lawmaking process, let us start with a flowchart that shows its bare bones framework. Remember, some elements of this flowchart are rules. For instance, look at this part of the lawmaking process where the nodal ministry, which is the ministry that drafts the law, is introducing a draft law into the parliament. A rule that governs this part is for the nodal ministry to circulate the draft among MPs 2 days before introduction. As we said, circulation to MPs 2 days before introduction into parliament is a hard and fast rule. Its legal basis comes from the fact that it is made under Article 118 of the Indian Constitution. Now focus here where the Parliament is sending a draft law for scrutiny to committees. This practice is merely a tradition. Traditions, as we said, are optional because they are followed by custom. Even the practice of suspending a question hour only with the unanimous consent of MPs is a tradition. Finally, here the ministry is putting out the draft law for public consultation. This is the guideline and it is described in a document called the Pre-Legislative Consultation Policy. As we mentioned earlier, this guideline is optional, but it carries more weight than traditions because it comes from the law ministry. Also, the pre-legislative consultation policy says that if the nodal ministry wants to waive the policy, it must record its reasons in a note to the cabinet. We will share this table with you in the description of our video. You can view all parliamentary rule books, guidelines, and commentary text in the source section.
Now, let's start with the first step of the lawmaking process, which is when the nodal ministry decides to either make or amend a law. This ministry can have various motivations for bringing in a new law or amending an existing one. It could be that a court judgment required the government to write or amend a legislation. For instance, the impetus for the Personal Data Protection Bill came from a landmark Supreme Court judgment which upheld the right to privacy as a fundamental right. As part of the judgment, the court also told the government to write a data protection law. There can also be a political agenda behind new bills. So, for instance, the BJP in its 2019 election manifesto said they would abrogate Article 370, which gives a special status to Jammu and Kashmir. Then, after the BJP got re elected, they brought in a bill to do exactly this. Anyway, regardless of the motivation, the nodal ministry begins drafting what is called a white paper, which explains the background of the bill. Once prepared, The ministry sends this white paper to the legislative department, which is a department under the law ministry, which then proceeds to write the draft law.
This draft law is then put out for public comments as recommended by the pre-legislative consultation policy. This policy was introduced in February 2014. The thinking behind it was that new laws are often complex and contentious, and so it is important to build a consensus among stakeholders impacted by such laws while drafting them. This is what the policy aims to do. Among other things, this policy explains how public consultations should happen. The nodal ministry shouldn't just publish a draft of the law, the policy says, but should also share it proactively with people, and the draft must remain in public domain for at least 30 days. What's more, the policy says, when the proposed legislation affects a specific group of people, take for instance the forest bill which affects forest dwelling communities, it should be given wider publicity through print and electronic media. Other means to ensure wide circulation could include translations into local languages to ensure it reaches affected communities.
The next step is where the nodal ministry considers the public comments and also consults with other ministries whose work could be impacted by the bill. In the case of the forest bill, the relevant ministries include the Tribal Affairs Ministry, the Rural Development Ministry, and the Road Transport Ministry. After this, the legislative department under the law ministry finalizes the draft law. This is presented before the cabinet, and if the cabinet approves it, the draft law is circulated to MPs before introduction into the parliament.
The circulation of the draft law among MPs is a very important step because MPs cannot knowledgeably discuss a bill before they have read it. Once the bill is in the parliament, it is sent to parliamentary committees for scrutiny. One reason for this step is that not every MP has the expertise to scrutinize nitty-gritties of technical laws. As Chakshu Roy from PRS Legislative Research told us, and we quote, when you have a discussion in a large chamber with multiple people sitting on a technical subject, the discussion is more at a broader level, maybe at a principled level, rather than the nuts and bolts kind of level. And so, to have a nuts and bolts kind of discussion, we need specialized committees. Secondly, MPs may not be comfortable voicing their views on the law in the public forum of the parliament, especially if these views don't echo the stand taken by their party. They are far more likely to speak candidly and prioritize public interest if they have a confidential, safe space to do so. Parliamentary committees serve both these purposes. They are made up of experts on the subject of the draft law, and the deliberations take place behind closed doors. Now, after the Parliamentary Committee report is ready, it is presented before both houses of Parliament along with the bill. MPs can use this report to debate on and vote on the bill. Once voting is complete, the bill moves on to the next house and then to the President for approval.
Now that we know how the lawmaking process works, let's get into some examples of how the BJP flouted the rules, traditions, and guidelines that govern this process.
Our first example has to do with the BJP flouting an important guideline, namely the pre-legislative consultation policy. This happened during the monsoon session when the BJP introduced the Forest Conservation Amendment Bill. As we mentioned earlier, the pre-legislative consultation policy helps in building a consensus on contentious bills that impact many people. The Forest Bill was one such bill which made it easier to divert forest land by narrowing the legal definition of what a forest is. The impact of this bill on people is huge. Tribal communities who live in forests and draw their livelihood from forest resources would bear the brunt of it. So if the policy was followed, the ministry would have done a thorough consultation with these communities and also other experts like conservationists and environmental lawyers. But this didn't happen. And yet, no rules were broken, no laws were breached because the pre-legislative consultation policy is only a guideline. The BJP government has flouted this policy elsewhere too. They failed to follow it while drafting two other laws, namely the Jan Vishwas Bill and the Biological Diversity Amendment Bill. The Jan Vishwas Bill amended India's key drug law, the Drugs and Cosmetics Act, to remove jail terms for the manufacture of poor quality drugs. Such a decriminalization impacts all Indians who can be hurt from consuming poor quality drugs. This means that the government should have publicized the bill very widely and consulted expert groups like health activists while drafting the amendment. This didn't happen. As for the Biodiversity Bill, it exempts certain persons like those from the Ayush industry from sharing profits from accessing biological resources like herbs and associated traditional knowledge with local communities. Since this directly affects such communities, The ministry should have consulted them on the provisions of the bill. This also didn't happen.
A second example is about the BJP flouting an important parliamentary rule which requires draft laws to be circulated among MPs 2 days before introduction into the Rajya Sabha. The BJP flouted this rule while amending the National Capital Territory of Delhi Laws Special Provisions Second Act in the 2023 winter session of the Rajya Sabha. The goal of this amendment was to extend protection to unauthorized development like colonies, slum dwellings, and schools in and around Delhi by 3 years. As we said earlier, this rule exists because MPs cannot knowledgeably discuss a draft law and vote on it unless they have enough time to read through the law. Such circulation beforehand also allows MPs to vote against the introduction of draft laws into the parliament. There could be legitimate reasons to do this. For instance, let's say a member wants to introduce a bill on a subject which is only on the state list of the Constitution. For example, police and public order are two such subjects which are on the state list. This means that the parliament may not have the power to make laws on these subjects. It is up to the state government to do so. MPs can cite this as a reason to block the law before introduction itself. The BJP has broken the rule on circulating bills before introduction earlier too. A previous instance in which the BJP government completely sidestepped this rule was while introducing the Jammu and Kashmir Reorganization Bill in 2019, a bill which sought to break the state of Jammu and Kashmir into two union territories. As Mansi Verma, a legislative policy expert at the parliamentary watchdog body Madhyam writes, the BJP government did not even list this bill before introducing it into the Rajya Sabha on 5th August 2019, let alone circulate it 2 days in advance. The chairperson, Venkaiah Naidu, merely waved off the need for circulation, citing the urgency of the bill. Verma argues that this was a clear violation of parliamentary rules. Her reasoning? The rule only allows the Rajya Sabha chairperson to tweak the 2-day prior circulation period to a shorter period, let's say 2 hours. It does not allow the chairperson to waive off circulation altogether, as the BJP did both in 2023 with the National Capital Territory Bill and in 2019 with the J&K Bill.
Our next example is about the tradition of sending bills to committees for further scrutiny after they are introduced into the parliament. There are two types of committees. One is called a departmentally related standing committee, which is constituted every year. We'll refer to it as a standing committee from now on. And the other is an ad hoc committee called the Joint Parliamentary Committee, or a JPC. The JPC is created de novo, meaning it starts fresh for the express purpose of scrutinizing the bill. It also ceases to exist once the job is done. And a long-standing tradition of the parliament has been that when a standing committee relevant to the topic of the bill exists, the bill is sent to that standing committee rather than creating a new JPC. The Speaker flouted this tradition by sending the forest bill to a JPC when a standing committee for the purpose already existed. This is the Standing Committee on Science and Technology, Environment and Forests. This decision to send the bill to a JPC instead of the standing committee was vigorously protested by Jairam Ramesh, former Environment Minister who chaired this committee. And the JPC, incidentally headed by a BJP MP, which assessed the forest bill, ended up giving it a clean check with zero recommendations for changes. It did so despite receiving many objections from other ministries like Tribal Affairs and Panchayat Raj, some state governments from the Northeast, and also conservationists, environmental lawyers, and tribal groups. Now let's understand why standing committees are preferred to JPCs. For one thing, standing committees oversee particular ministries, and so they have more expertise on subjects related to that ministry. As MP from Trinamool Congress Jawar Sirkar puts it, their members tackle issues related to the ministry day in and day out. Some of the standing committee members have been on the committee for years and have drilled the ministry several times earlier on similar themes. This means that the standing committee members are likely to be familiar with the subject and the story behind the bill itself. Today, we have 24 such specialized standing committees, like a committee on health and family welfare, a committee on petroleum and natural gas, and a committee on science and technology, environment and forests. So many bills introduced into the parliament will likely already have a relevant standing committee. and the need to create a JPC arises only in some circumstances. According to Madhyam's Verma, these circumstances could include situations when the relevant standing committee gets held up with other work, like scrutinizing annual reports of the ministry they are affiliated with. In other words, they may simply not have the time to deliberate on all bills in their area of expertise. All experts we spoke to agreed broadly that when a standing committee relevant to the topic of the bill exists, then this standing committee is best placed to scrutinize the bill. But this practice of sending bills to standing committees is only a tradition. It is not codified as a parliamentary rule. The BJP government has sent several other bills to JPCs when relevant standing committees exist, including the biodiversity bill. In fact, escaping scrutiny by any committee, not just standing committees, has been a trend with the BJP since 2014. In the current 17th Lok Sabha and the previous 16th Lok Sabha, far fewer bills were referred to committees compared to earlier times. According to PRS legislative research, only 16% of bills went to committees in the 17th Lok Sabha and 27% in the 16th. Now compare this to 60% in the 14th Lok Sabha and 71% in the 15th.
Our final example has to do with the question hour. One of the important parliamentary rules is for the question hour to be held in every session unless the speaker suspends it. This rule is accompanied by a long standing tradition that the question hour is only suspended with the unanimous approval of MPs. In other words, even if the speaker has the power to suspend the question hour unilaterally, he or she has rarely done so in the past. Historically, the speaker has exercised this power of suspension without unanimous approval only in unusual circumstances. One such circumstance was the 1975 emergency, a dark time for Indian democracy. Despite the existence of this tradition, in September last year, the BJP government suspended the question hour while calling for a special session of the parliament. A special session is one that is held outside the conventional budget, monsoon, and winter sessions. In its notice, the government said there wouldn't be any question hour in both Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha. No reasons were given for this decision, and the unanimous consent of MPs was most certainly not taken. Why is the question hour important? It is one of the few ways for the parliament to hold the government to account. As opposition MPs argued in a letter to the speaker when the BJP suspended the question hour earlier, one of the main functions of the parliament in a democracy is to seek accountability from the executive on behalf of the people and the parliament. Questions are the most potent tool in this regard. There exists no other platform like the floor of the parliament for the people to question the executive through their representatives. The last time the BJP suspended the question hour was in 2020. At that time, they cited an oddly flimsy reason that due to the COVID pandemic, the parliament needed to keep the number of people in it to a bare minimum and to maintain social distancing. The reason we call this justification flimsy is that the government proposed that a total of 33 bills be considered in the same session. So the COVID pandemic was a good enough reason for the government to suspend question hour, but not good enough to hold back the bills they wanted to push through. Anyway, eventually the Lok Sabha speaker allowed only written questions to be asked in that session, and no question hour was held.
The examples we discussed tell us why rules, traditions, and guidelines are all equally critical to the functioning of the parliament. And yet, rules carry a greater weight. When they are broken, MPs can raise this issue with the speaker. This is called raising a point of order. They can even bring in a no confidence motion against the chairman or the speaker of the house for not following rules. This is what 46 opposition MPs did after the passage of the farm bills in 2020. Finally, MPs and citizens can even challenge the breaking of parliamentary rules in court, as AAP member Raghav Chadda did in 2023 when he was suspended from the Rajya Sabha. Raising these issues and challenging them in court would have been harder to do with guidelines and traditions.
This is why it is important to turn crucial parliamentary processes like sending bills to committees into mandatory rules. In fact, a few experts, including Madhyam, have come together to push for changes exactly like this. They've drafted a manifesto titled People's Demands to Make Parliament Great Again, which recommends several such reforms. These reforms would allow MPs to hold the executive accountable and to prevent further democratic backsliding. You can see the manifesto in the link below. It is also open to further public consultation.
If you're wondering why such reforms haven't happened yet, a big reason is lack of political will. In one of her papers, Madhyam Swarma argues that it is not in the best interest of political parties, be it ruling parties or the opposition, to carry out such reforms. This is because the current vagueness tends to benefit whichever party is in power. And this is a status quo everyone wants to maintain.
Is there any answer to this problem then? We think that change can come if citizens understand the need for parliamentary reforms and seek such reforms from their MPs. This was one big motivation for us to track these parliamentary sessions.
We were shocked to see the manner in which bills were pushed through. Most of the time, this happened when the opposition was not in the room because MPs either boycotted the session to highlight concerns about Manipur or were suspended en masse. We wanted to understand what made it so easy for the BJP government to pass amendments to crucial legislations without wider deliberation, either with the public or with opposition MPs. And we found that parliamentary processes were so poorly codified that members could break them with almost no consequences. This is more so in cases where the ruling government enjoys a strong majority in both houses of parliament. Properly codified processes would make it easier to uphold principles of a deliberative democracy where the majority cannot just run roughshod over the minority. And there is reason to be optimistic. Reforms for better parliamentary functioning have been happening over the years, even if slowly.
Our hope with this video is to focus on the urgent need for such reforms and for citizens to push for them. The people who have the greatest stake in parliamentary reforms are, after all, not political parties, but us, the common voters. The codification of parliamentary procedures then is a cause every one of us must fight for.